Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first OutLoud lecture of the 2018 season. We're really happy to have you here, and for those who have been here before, welcome back. It's a pleasure. Thank you all for coming, and it's wonderful to see how many people are gathering today to learn about an exciting program area where Argonne really has aggregated a number of scientists and engineers from several parts of the lab to work together. It's really exciting. I'm Christina Negri. I am the director of Argonne's Environmental Science Division, and I'm glad to be here with you today. So, science and the transformation of cities. Why do we care? Well, cities in large metropolitan areas like Chicago and the Chicagoland area are where businesses reside, big and small, finance, activities of various kinds, commerce, arts of all kinds, restaurants and culinary experiences, and all converge there, and they support and grow the economy. They entertain us, they delight us, they give us problems, and make us think and expand our worldview. However, cities are places that are growing many times rapidly. There is statistics that say that by 2050, about 80% of the world population will be in cities. Technology changes, and hence there is a need for cities to renew themselves and to grow in a way that's really in sync with what else is happening in the world. We need to make our lives easier, better for everybody, and we need to accommodate even more scientific discoveries and the way the world evolves with us. Tonight's speaker is Ralph Muehleisen. He will discuss how scientifically based analysis, advancements, and recommendations are necessary to enable cities to transform successfully. Ralph is a building scientist, and he leads the Argonne research to increase the energy efficiency and resiliency of the built environment, while improving the quality of life and return on investment for citizens. So please help me welcome to the stage Ralph Muehleisen.
All right, thank you. All right. Thank you all for coming. I'm excited to talk to such a big crowd, and thank you all who are listening and viewing the simulcast. I just found out today we have this video simulcast, so thank you all for tuning in, and to my friend who can't be here, I love you. Take care. We're here, and I want to talk to you about cities because we have the situation of cities growing, industry growing, society growing, and with the growing cities, the growing population comes some problems. Urbanization is not a straightforward linear process. So I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the challenges, but we've got exciting things going on here at Argonne. We think we can help solve some of those problems that are coming along with urbanization. So one of the things here to be thinking about is cities have been growing for a long time. Cities have been around for thousands of years, and cities are trying to evolve. Why do we want to worry about urbanization now? What's different? So before we actually talk about why this has become a problem, there are challenges, let's take a little bit of a history lesson. We can go back here, and about 12,000 years ago, people learned to farm and domesticate animals, and people began to settle in one spot. You didn't have to run around and chase animals. You didn't have to run around and gather food, and you could stay in one spot. That was the beginning of civilization as we know it, and people in single spots, and that's the beginning of cities. As time went on and people developed a little bit of technology, cities began to grow. About 2,000 years ago, so 10,000 years after that, we had cities getting pretty big. Rome, around the 1st century AD, had gotten to be 1 million people. And they only got to be that way because they decided that in order to sustain this number of people and to let the society grow, we had to find a way to have people communicate together, to connect together, and deal with some of the issues that were going on at the time. So they invented roads. paving with gravel, paving with wood. They invented water systems, aqueducts to bring water, clean water, into the city of Rome, and sewer systems to take away the waste. They started using geothermal power to heat their baths and heat their buildings. So it was the fact that they were developing technology that let them get to the point of 1 million people. If we move forward about 1,000 years, we got Kaifeng and Baghdad were the biggest cities in the world. Rome had gone through a little bit of a decline, if you remember your history. It was still only about 1 million people. We hadn't really grown. There hadn't been much in the way of technological advance over what we had happening when Rome was built. Let's go 500 years from that. Kaifeng and Baghdad had shrunk a little bit, and now we have Beijing. Beijing is the largest city in the world. It's still only 1 million people. Let's go forward a little bit more. And we're getting to the beginning of the 19th century. We're at the edge of the 18th century. The Industrial Revolution is happening, and now the biggest city in the world is London, and it's still just about 1 million people, a little bit over. But things are about to change rapidly, because what did we have happening at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century? I mentioned the Industrial Revolution. We had the Scientific Revolution as well, which led to our Industrial Revolution. So we had people thinking about how I can use the methods of science to understand the world, to understand materials, to understand processes, to start developing technologies that are going to let us change our society. So in the next 100 years, we go from 1 million people, or 1.2 million people in London, to 6 million. That was spurred by growth in technology and things that are happening in science and engineering. We now fast forward 50 years, and we go from 6 million people to 12 million people. New York City was the largest city in the world in 1950. And it was because of the development of steel and skyscrapers and advances in transportation like cars that let us go from 6 million up to 12 million. Fast forward another 50 years, we get to Tokyo. Tokyo is 25 million people. Now, there wasn't a lot of change in transportation, although there was some electrification of rail. At this point, we had a change that had to do with communication, and it had to do with electronics. So we've gone through a process where we can see this sort of geometric change in what's happening with cities and population. But aside from communication, we haven't had a big change in how we move people, how we build buildings, how we feed people in the last 50 or so years. And yet we still have buildings and cities getting bigger. So let's think about what this means in terms of the change in population. In 1900, about 14%, 1 in every 7 people lived in a city. It was a small fraction of the population. As Christina just mentioned, in 2008, we did the switchover. By 2008, we had people moving from the country, from the rural, from the farms into the cities, and we had half the people of the world were sitting in cities, and half the people were out in the country. And it's expected here by about 2050, it's 70 or 80%, depends upon whose statistics you pick, of the people are going to be living in cities. This change, where we went from 14% to 70% of the people in cities in 150 years, is far more rapid than we had ever seen before. And the problems that this drives are daunting. Let's put this a little bit in perspective. Right now, China is growing faster than just about any country in the world. By 2030, in 15 years, they're going to add 400 million more people, not just 400, 400 million more people into cities, okay? 400 million. That's one Chicago being added to the country every month. One entire Chicago they are building every month. That is bringing with it a lot of problems. We think about why are there problems from this urbanization? Cities are the primary driver of climate variability. Greenhouse gas emissions, 70% comes from our cities. It's because of all the industry, all the transportation, all the electricity generation. So you know, it's, okay, cities are bad. Cities are bad. They're the ones that are helping our planet melt. But if you actually look, it's not all bad, because per person, per capita, cities are actually not as bad as people living out in the country. A farmer has a lot of more energy footprint than that person living in the city. So you have to kind of put things in perspective. Cities are the central drivers of our energy use, our energy production, and which means they're also our central driver of security related to our energy system. We have to be thinking in this transformation of our cities, this urbanization, of how vulnerable our energy systems are and what services we have to provide, not only to deal with natural disasters that come from variability, but possibly man-made disasters. However, thinking about this, it also gives us an opportunity, because when we have a city, cities are closer together, people are closer together, it actually makes it easier to secure those resources because of the compact nature. Not all things that come from cities are bad, though. Cities, as Christina also mentioned, are the central drivers of the world economy. 80% of our gross domestic product in the world come from cities. This is the engine of industry. This is the engine of finance. This is the engine of research. This is the engine of education. You look at every socioeconomic metric there is, just about, and they're all higher in cities. You look at the quality of life, the happiness, the health statistics, they're all better in cities than out in the country. Well, I guess not everything is good, because there are some other statistics that are also a little bit higher. Crime rates tend to be higher. Asthma rates tend to be higher. That has to do with pollution. So we have a situation here. We have good things come from cities. We have a lot of things going on here that we need to be thinking about. One of the ways to help us understand cities a little bit better, these are complex systems. We have systems upon systems that connect to systems that go to other systems, and then there's a system all around it. It's a hard thing to figure out, and when we talk about the ideas of using science to understand a city and engineering to build technology to make better cities, let's try to figure out what is it that we know, or we hope we know pretty well, that might have analogies to a city. So one of these is a people. It's a pretty complex system, but I know that if I don't get sleep tonight, I'm going to wake up in the morning and not feel well. I know that if I go out golfing on the weekend, like I did a few weeks ago with my neighbor, I'm going to wake up sore on Monday morning. I know how this happens. I know why it happens. I don't exercise enough, you can see. So why don't we know that about cities? Why is it that we don't know that if I go ahead and put a power plant in the wrong place, I'm going to have pollution, which causes asthma, which causes kids to not be in school, which drops the socioeconomic levels of that neighborhood? Why are we not getting that? Maybe it's we have to start thinking more about cities like people and use science and engineering. So let's look at how cities are like people. Cities have a circulatory system, just like people. We've got traffic systems that move around the essential nutrients around our body, just the same way that the cars and the trains and the bicycles and the sidewalks move people, and move our food, and move our gas, and move our Amazon packages. Let's be serious. We know what we're all waiting to get home for, right? Cities have a skeletal system. We've got the steel and concrete that make up our buildings, make up our skyscrapers, make up our roads. We even have exoskeletons like the John Hancock Building. I'm not suggesting that the John Hancock Building is the cockroach of Chicago. I like the John Hancock Building. Cities have a digestive system. We have clean water that comes in, and we have waste that goes away, just like we do in our body. Cities have a nervous system, ways of communication and energy flows that go around our body, just like the electrical and telephone wires that go in our city. So if we think about it, this complex system of a city isn't so much different from a complex system of our bodies. Okay, so what does that have to do with urbanization? What it comes down to is thinking about how medicine has transformed over the past 100 years. If we think 100 years ago, what medicine was and what it was today, and look at the changes. 100 years ago, we had no antibiotics. There were a few vaccines, but nobody knew how they really worked. We had x-rays, and all they did was kill you because nobody knew how much dose to give you. You didn't have medical imaging like PAT scan and PET scans and MAT scans and CAT scans and FET scans, and you give me another scan, give me another set of words and I can make another scan for you. We didn't have that. Yet look today. We have wiped out smallpox. We've almost wiped out polio. We have antibiotics that are so good we can knock out the bacteria that are antibiotic resistant, maybe. That has happened because we use the methods of science to understand how the body works, how cells work, and then we develop technology like pills, like vaccines, like antibiotics and medical imaging that let us do a much better job of diagnosing and treating our bodies. 100 years ago, medicine was liquor and cocaine. That's what you had in a bottle. And you bought it at the drugstore. And you hoped it worked. And if it didn't work, you at least felt a little bit better the next day. But it didn't really do the job. I think that our understanding of cities is a lot closer to medical elixirs of the 1900s than it is to the medical imaging we have today. And that's where the hope of science to understand our city as a complex system and how things are connected, and then engineering to develop the technologies to solve those problems I talked about come into play. So let's think, what if we applied those methods of science and engineering to our urban system? What can we do and what can we hope in 100 years comes from the urban sprawl that this is, I can't remember what city it was. Unfortunately, when I pulled down the picture, I've forgotten what city it was. I do believe it may be Mexico City. So let's think, what would we want? What do we want our city to look like in 100 years? So imagine a city that is designed to be resilient to disasters, natural disasters, maybe too much rain, maybe too much wind. So we have vegetation to help absorb the water. We have backup batteries to make sure our power continues. We have a city that uses 50% less energy, but it has better economic output. So solar panels that are on those stores to keep them running when you may have power outages and not to draw it from coal and natural gas power plants. Imagine a city that has traffic that actually flows nicely. Imagine that. While you lower the cost and while you lower emissions. Imagine that city that becomes a place, a tourist destination. So you have people all over the world coming, not only coming and getting vital money to the economy, it's spreading the word of how you design a city. That is a smart city. People use the term smart city very loosely. And they say, if you go and put a Wi-Fi connection on your lamppost, you are a smart city. That's not a smart city. A smart city has intelligence, it has communications, but it's designed smart too. This, what I want to have in 100 years, is a smart city. So think about what is it going to take to actually make those cities and turn our old cities into those cities. It's going to be taking science and engineering. So let's think about what branches of science and engineering we want to put together. So the first thing I think of when I think about urban society and making it better is building science. Well, partially I'm a building scientist, I confess. It's self-serving. But buildings were the very first parts of our society. Once we had our farm and once we had our plants, we built shelters. We have food, clothing, shelter. Okay, what was the third one is shelter. It's not food, clothing, roads. It's not food, clothing, cell phones. Although my daughter may believe food, clothing, cell phones. Yeah, okay, that comes before shelter. Food, clothing, shelter. So, it's the oldest part of our civilization that came into cities. Yet, when you look here, it hasn't changed design much in the past 100 years. The last big invention in buildings was air conditioning. That was 100 and some years ago. You can say, okay, I've got a control system, I got a fancy thermostat. I haven't changed the way I make my walls. I haven't changed the way I create heat for my building, and I haven't changed the way I cooled it in 100 years. So we need to start thinking here about the science of how to design buildings better. But more than that, we have to understand how our building connects to the other systems. Buildings are where we house people, but they go onto a train and a car to go to another building. They interact with a water system. They interact with the air and the atmosphere. They interact with our energy systems. We need to understand the interaction a lot better. The second thing that we had when we were building our civilization was a building and another building that was far away. So what do? We built a trail to go between the buildings. It's our first transportation system. We get to Rome, and they started using wood and stone and gravel to pave so they could go longer distances with carts and chariots. Well, we look and see what has changed in transportation over the past 50 years. When we look at the car, it's gotten more efficient, but it hasn't changed that much. We have electric cars that are coming, but they're really not quite here. The closest thing we've had to a change is how we actually use transportation. I can pull out my cell phone and call Uber. Well, they can't make it here, but they can meet me at the front gate. But understanding how our transportation system connects up to our buildings and connects up to our communication system, and connects up to our water system, connects up to our atmosphere is something we need to know and understand to be able to do a better job with it. Water science. We have water systems. That was the next thing that Rome developed, to bring clean water and take it away. And if we've been paying any attention to Flint, Michigan the past few years, we know we don't always do that very well. We have an old water system that we want to try to do better. We try to switch over, and we destroy a community because of the lead in the pipes that we weren't thinking about when we made that change. Understanding when we make a change to a system, the effects and how that it's going to affect a community is what we need to do. We need to understand water science. Water is our next precious quantity that we're going to need to worry about. People have been saying for a while the next wars are going to be over water. I don't know right now, the way the world is on a tipping point, if it's going to be water, but in 50 years it may well be. We have to think about energy science, how we generate energy, how we transfer energy, and how we use energy. And the energy system is the main core for that water system, that transportation, and that building system. And understanding how they're linked together, when we look at our grid right now, our electric grid, it's aged, it's old. We have 640,000 square miles of cables running around this country that we need to protect and are outdated. And yet we're trying to now bring renewable energy, a fantastic resource, but it's variable. It goes up, it goes down. And clouds come over and the wind stops. And how do we integrate that into a power grid system that is already fragile is really difficult. We need science to understand how systems act and interact, and then we can develop engineering to deal with the consequences. We have environmental science, and Christina was very nice to let us, it's dear and dear to her heart. It's not quite as near and dear to mine because I'm a buildings person. But we need to be thinking about the atmosphere. That's actually the coupling of all of these systems all together. We could live without energy. We could live without water. Well, no, we can't. We could live without a water system. We can live without a transportation system. We can live without buildings. I can't live without air. If I'm sitting next to a volcano that's got noxious gases coming off, like some people in Hawaii right now, I may not be able to live there. And I have to think about the pollution that I put into this atmosphere and the way this couples to the transportation system and the water system and to the building system and then to the energy system. And last thing is understanding the people and their connection to the systems. The whole point of civilization was for people to connect with each other, to build a society. So understanding how people connect to each other, how they make decisions, and how they interact with the systems is core to us making a better society and a better civilization and correcting from the problems of urbanization. And it takes science to understand how we act and interact. And science to understand that if I change a road and put in a bike path, that reduces the pollution, that reduces the asthma, that reduces the kids being out of school, that's going to keep the kids in school, that's going to get them to the edge of the stage when they fall off and they come back the other way, and that keeps them in school so they have better jobs and they create a new economy. That's what we need to know. That's what we need to understand so that I don't make a mistake in putting my dollars into the wrong system or doing the wrong change to our city and our town. So, if we have this understanding in the science of how things interact, and I now want to develop the models that try to model that, I need data. I need to know how those interactions happen. So I have to collect observations of the world around me. That's the basis of science. I observe, I make a prediction, I make a model to predict, and then depending upon the science you're doing, maybe you can test it. If you happen to be an astrophysicist, it's a little bit hard to do a controlled experiment to test what's going on in your model. You have other ways to check it out, though. But we need to have sensors, and we need to have data. And there's an awful lot of data about cities. This is a big data problem. You hear the term big data? Trying to understand the ecosystem of urban is a big data problem. Once we go ahead and have the data, that's when we have to figure out these connections. We did the science so we could observe how things affect each other. Now we have to develop a model. And this model is a coupled system model. It's a model that models a system connecting to another system, connecting to another system, and then there's bigger connections around, and there's even bigger connections around the whole system. So I have my urban system here connecting to another urban system. This is a complicated system. It means that you have to do different computational science. But then, if we have that model, we can start doing things like optimization. If I'm going to go ahead and make a change to a road, what's the best change do I make? Do I put in the bike path? Do I go ahead and say that I'm going to make this for Uber lane? Do I go ahead and make this a bus lane? Which is the one that has the biggest impact? The biggest impact tomorrow for pollution, the biggest impact in 10 years for the economy. If you have a good coupled model with the proper sensors and data, and you've done good science, you may be able to help a policymaker make that decision, or at least a better decision they would have done just blindly picking one thing to do. Once we then have this idea to optimize and understand the coupled systems, we can actually think about designing a system that is robust to change. We know no matter what is going on, we'll have changes in our environment. Sometimes they're bad changes like climate change and global warming. Other times they're good change, like the fact that maybe I have more clear days of sunshine that are happening because of some other things with climate change. But understanding how our systems act and interact helps us to be able to design them to be resilient when we do have natural disasters, when we have man-made disasters. And that's what people really want. They want a system, and they want their taxpayer dollars, and they want their society to be resilient to bad effects and be ready to accept the good effects. So, you think about this. What we're really asking out of this science, and what we think science can do, is help these policymakers and the urban planners to understand alternative futures so that they can make the best decision of how to invest, what to invest, where to invest, and when to invest. And if they do that right, it really helps to understand and reveal those hidden costs and those hidden benefits. What is the cost if I go ahead and change my water from Detroit to a Lodal Walker system? If people had done a little bit more science and had a good coupled model, they would have realized in Flint the ramifications of trying to save $5 next year. And those mistakes hopefully wouldn't happen. One of the other things is we can often find those hidden benefits. The hidden benefits that are hiding, that are the result of people making decisions that affect other systems. The example I gave earlier of the bike lane, the understanding here that 10 years down the road, I may have a boon to this neighborhood because of the 30, 40, 50 kids who weren't missing school and missing their classes because of their asthma attacks. That's the sort of hidden benefit we're looking for. So, what does this really mean? We are looking to use science and engineering to improve our quality of life. You can think of it, if you're an economist, as a return on investment. But what we really are looking for is resiliency, reliability, sustainability, and what that means is we're going to have better health, better safety, better economy. We're just going to have a better life. And it's a better life for everybody in the country, in the city. So that's what we want. And that's what we think science and engineering can help us do. So let's talk about these systems and some of the work that we're doing here at Argonne to understand the science and produce some of the engineering. So the first thing I want to talk about is buildings. As I said before, buildings are near and dear to my heart. And we do work here at Argonne. In a lot of ways, we develop models of how buildings act and then interact with systems around. We develop models to understand how people make decisions in their buildings, how they decide, are they going to do an upgrade? Am I going to put solar panels on my house? Am I going to get new windows? Am I going to put in a Nest thermostat into my house? I should try that at my house sometime because I don't think I make rational decisions. We'll see if it really works on me. So one of the projects that I want to talk about, and there we go. You may have seen, if you were watching the video loop, you saw a lot about LAKESIM, and there's a poster out there. So LAKESIM project is one that started about 6 years ago. It has ended, but I want to tell you this is a perfect example of this sort of microcosm of coupled system. This is a project that was led by Charlie Catlett, Leah Gazowski, and there was a few other people, and I don't know how many of them might be here, but Bo Rada worked on this project. Brendan Albano, he unfortunately, I think, is probably still up in Oregon. He had worked for me for a little while and left because he had an opportunity to become a brilliant architect and decided he could make his fortune elsewhere. There's a few people you're going to hear a couple more times. Jonathan Ozick, Nick Collier, who worked on this project. And what we were trying to do with LAKESIM was develop a model and a systematic way of engineering an infrastructure to help a developer do a build-out. So LAKESIM was developed around the idea of a large patch of land that you're trying to redevelop. And in this case, the specific land was the U.S. Steel plant. You just probably heard about this in the news because another developer decided to give up on trying to redevelop it. It was just announced last week. But a few years back, the developers had worked with Argonne to try to develop energy models and transportation models. And what we wanted to do with the energy models is help the developer understand the energy use of that patch of land as they would do a build-out. So if you were a developer of 600 acres of pure land, pristine land that's sitting on the lakefront, you're trying to figure out, okay, what sort of mix of buildings, and when do I bring these buildings in, and when do I build them, and where do I build them on the 600 acres that is going to make me money? That you're a developer, that's what you're there for. So you have to be thinking not 10 years down the road, not 20 years down the road, 50 years down the road. And you have to be figuring out, how do I build up the 600 acres over that time? If you talk to developers today, they are used to working in 10, 20, 30 acres. That's a small plot, a small industrial plot. They can do that and look at this in 5, 10 years. 600 acres is way out of their realm of comfort and their realm of experience. So as they try to understand the idea here, I want to have a new neighborhood here that is carbon-free or is completely powered by renewables. I have to understand how the cost of renewables is going to change over that 50-year cycle. I have to understand how the technology efficiency is going to change over that 50-year cycle so that I can figure out, when do I put in new solar plants? When do I put up a wind plant? When do I put in the geothermal plant? How big do I make it so that I can still make money on my project? So the understanding of how energy changes and energy uses was what we were trying to help them do over the lifetime. And the reason why a place like a national lab is particularly adept at this is because we're the people developing the new technologies that will be in the market in 10 years and 20 years. So we have an idea of how things are going to change and what the cost might be, more than many other consultants. The other thing you have to be thinking about is transportation. So how does the transportation in this system work? Because it's not just, are the roads happening here? How is this going to affect the roads that are in nearby neighborhood? How is this going to affect the Skyway and I-94 and the Eisenhower and the Stevenson? Because when I go ahead and start moving cars at one place, it's for those of you who know chaos theory, a butterfly flapping its wings in China creates a typhoon over on the other side of the world. Well, the little car that's sitting on the lakeside spot can cause a traffic jam over on the Eisenhower. It seems to happen all the time. So now we know who to blame. It's all those cars that are over on the lakefront. This is that effect that's going on. But being able to understand how your traffic on one part of the city is going to affect another is something you need to be able to do. And that's the sort of work we were doing over at LAKESIM. So energy systems are really important. And you talk about the idea here of LAKESIM and bringing out and building out the energy system. We do a lot of other work here at Argonne, and particularly when it comes to resiliency, we do a lot of work that's related to understanding how distribution systems, the wires that go from your house over to a central station, how they're affected by natural disaster, how they're affected by man-made disaster. Somebody who runs their car into a stoplight and takes it down can affect ripples all around the city. So trying to understand that connectivity and how you can design something resilient is part of the work that we do. One of the things that we're doing in a project with ComEd and with Illinois Institute of Technology, Illinois Tech, I still call it IIT. I used to be a professor at IIT. My wife, who's a professor there now, has reminded me, no, it is Illinois Tech. They go by Illinois Tech now, for those of you who don't know. So Illinois Tech is working with Argonne and ComEd to put in a microgrid in the Bronzeville neighborhood, right next to Illinois Tech. So a microgrid is a small section of the electrical grid that can disconnect itself from the main grid. It's able to have centralized or decentralized power. You will have electric, you could have electric generators that are diesel generators or natural gas. You could have solar, you could have wind. You could have microturbines in your building where you go ahead and heat your building and use the waste heat to generate electricity. Or you generate electricity and use your waste heat to heat the building. Those are sort of things that you do what's called distributed generation. And IIT has their own little microgrid that they can disconnect the whole university from the ComEd grid around. ComEd is trying to right next door build another microgrid in the town and connect the two together so that we can see how you can share energy back and forth between microgrids and how you can control systems when you might have solar power that's on one microgrid and you have wind power in another microgrid and you are trying to balance loads between the two. The people who are working on this we've got staff here at Argonne. Chanan Liu has been working on this quite a bit, and a few other people working on microgrids. Ning Kang, who else are we? I don't want to be missing anybody. Ravindra Singh and Dongbo Zhao are all people who had contributed to this project in one way or another. We look at transportation. Transportation is undergoing an enormous revolution. How we use transportation and how we are going to power our cars in the future is going through a big change right now. One of the interesting things is we talk about electrification, at least at the research level, electrification of our society and the change from gasoline to electric vehicles. If we can make the electricity cleanly, like with solar and wind power, transportation can become virtually carbon-free. But let's think about what is also happening, and it is transportation as a service, the fact that I have Uber, and we have vehicles that can be autonomous and drive. What does that end up meaning? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Because depending upon how you analyze the system and what assumptions you make, we could be using half as much energy in 20 years for transportation or 2 times as much. You say, how can I use 2 times as much? Well, if instead of me having a car and you having a car, we just have a bunch of cars that autonomously go around in circles all day, waiting to pick up, waiting for me to call on my Uber, they're going to use a lot more energy. Now, if it's all coming from renewables, maybe it's not so bad, but there's a lot of other infrastructure that goes into this that we need to be thinking about. So understanding how vehicles can change, how people can make decisions on how they use their vehicles is one of the things we're trying to understand here as a science. And one of the projects that is going on is something called POLARIS, which is a model it's called an agent-based model. We try to model each individual vehicle, maybe not exactly your car, but statistically each and every vehicle, and the drivers and the decisions that they make. And if you actually look up here, you can see a picture of what looks like Lakeside, because this was a transportation model, or one of the transportation models we used to analyze Lakeside. So what we did with Lakeside and with Polaris is you can go ahead here and during a build-out, you can follow the cars. Now you're saying, okay, I just got a little animation. This is statistically what we expect the transportation system to be doing and where the cars are going. With this, you can start making plans for when I have to expand roads. When do I need to make sure I've got Lakeshore Drive extended here? When do I need another off-ramp from the Skyway? So you saw that little thing going along. But where it really comes into play, the ability to do this sort of modeling, comes into play when we look at the bigger ecosystem. So we'll start this out again, and we see the animation going. But now we're going to start and look and see how the impact as we go out. We can see the Skyway. We can see the Dan Ryan. We can see the Stevenson. We can see the Eisenhower. And we can zoom out a little bit more here. And we can not only see our area, we can see the entire Chicago ecosystem. So the models that we have will look at the entire Chicago metro area, all 10 million people, all 28 million transits per day that those 10 million people do, and we can put it into a model and understand the little butterfly ripple. What happens when we have a traffic jam in the Lakeside development, and how does that affect the Eisenhower and the Stevenson and the Dan Ryan? And that helps us to understand how we might change the transportation system and the signals to avoid those problems. We can look at the environment. Now, the environment couples to all our other systems. So one of the things as we're talking about this change in urbanization, and we know we're spitting out a lot of carbon, and we know that's affecting our atmosphere, and we know that it's affecting the way that we have storms, is trying to understand those impacts. So some of the research we do here is taking large-scale climate models that will do a prediction in 50 years of how we expect on a large global scale the energy flows in the atmosphere to change. What you can do from that is run a little local weather file, or a little meta model, and then understand in the year 2050, given a certain assumption of climate change that you can get from the large model, what's going to happen to my local weather? Now, I can't tell you in the year 2050 that it's going to rain on a Tuesday, but I can tell you from these models in 2050 that in that year 2050, you're going to have 2 times as many storms. And the heat wave is going to be 50% longer, and it's going to be about 10 degrees warmer. I'm just making those numbers up. I can't tell you that's exactly the numbers. But the idea here is those are the predictions. I can understand the intensity, the duration, and the frequency of the storms. That's the information I need to design the new water systems, to design my building better. So we're going ahead and using these climate models to develop localized weather so that we can understand how to design my building, my transportation system, my power system to be resilient in the year 2050. So as we go through here, one of these things that connects all of these systems, we already talked about is socioeconomics. So we have another group of people here who are working on a model called CHI-SIM. So that's a Chicago social interaction model. You probably saw some videos that were out, saw the videos coming by. So Chick Makel's here along with, I don't know how many of the rest of his group who is here, but I mentioned Jonathan Ozick, and I mentioned Eric Tatara, and Nick Collier, and Diane Graziano. So they've been developing these models of how people act and interact with a lot of different uses. So one of them is here looking at the spread of MRSA virus. So for those of you who are athletes, and you go ahead and you wrestle, and you go into the shower, you know that you can be spreading this all over. This is what happens when your MRSA gets out of control. But this is an example of one of the things that you can do with a model like this. We want to use this so that we can understand how people will use a transportation system, how people are going to change the way that they actually act and interact with their building, how they're going to change how they do communication. Now, unfortunately, we at Argonne tend to be worriers sometimes. And when we actually have time, on occasion, we watch TV. And so what happens when you watch TV and you're a worrier and you happen to watch Walking Dead, you worry about zombie attacks. And so one of the things that they did was say, let's apply this model. We can apply this model. We can apply this model. There we go. We could apply this model to the zombie apocalypse. Now, the science is watching TV and understanding how fast zombies move. But the bad news is, my friends, when the zombie apocalypse comes, we have 60 days, and we're overtaken. So there's other good things. We can use our science and engineering to know that we need to get out of Chicago if there's a zombie apocalypse. So these models, this modeling that we're doing is all fed by data. We need to have data. We need to have a sensor system for the city. So how do you collect data for a city? You need to know about the atmosphere. I need to know about people, where they are, how they're moving. I don't need to know what color shoes they have on, and I don't need to know what their favorite music is, but I do need to know where they're going, so it's people flows. And so one of the things we're doing here is Charlie Catlett. He was the person who started the Lakeside project. He's the person who's the head of the Array of Things. So Charlie Catlett got together with the city of Chicago and the University of Chicago and is developing this array of things. It's really a true partnership. So this is a set of sensors. By the time they're done in a couple of years, there'll be 500 of these sensors all over the city. And the sensors are here. The very first ones were chosen to look at 4 problems. They want to look at asthma. They want to look at lake effect in terms of atmosphere. They want to look at traffic flow. And they want to look at flooding. So the array of things had a set of sensors that can measure the atmosphere. It has cameras that can take a picture of looking for people counting, and it has cameras that can look for flooding events. But one of the things you might say, oh God, there's cameras. There's cameras everywhere. They've got microphones. They can listen to me. People are going to be taking my picture. So part of the whole key to the array of things is a combination of scientists with the residents and the government, that there is a pact that goes on that you don't get a sensor in your neighborhood unless you understand what it is that we're taking for data, and you agree to have that data taken. So it isn't something that's forced down in any neighborhood. No neighborhood gets one without having community meetings and a community agreement. So one of the things, for those of you who are aware of this and been thinking about this and know about this project, I want to make a little bit clear is the sort of things that are doing. The computer vision that's going on here is not taking video and it's not going to the cloud. We use very fancy edge computing, so it's basically cell phones that are in this device that are doing detection of events. They don't take a picture of you. They take a picture of the outside of your edge and they count that you went past this place at a given time. And you can do something like count the number of people on divvy bikes who are wearing bicycle helmets. And then with that sort of information, the city knows, oh wait, do we have a safety problem or do we not have a safety problem? That's the sort of thing we're doing. We aren't taking pictures of everybody and sending them up to the cloud. We aren't taking voice recordings of what you're talking about. We're just taking a level of what the sound level might be and sending that up to the cloud. So all of this comes together, this huge amount of data and the huge coupled models, and in a way that is being transformed by revolutions in computing. So we at Argonne are really fortunate as scientists and engineers to have access to one of the most enormous facilities for computing in the world. And it's computing facilities like this that are going to be necessary to run these coupled models. In 2 years, 3 years, 3 years? Yeah, 3 years, we're going to be getting Aurora. And Aurora is supposed to be the first exaflop computer system. What that means is 10 to the 18th, or 1 quadrillion computations a second. Go from billion to a trillion to a quadrillion. It's a quintillion. I'm sorry, it's a quintillion calculations per second, 1 with 18 zeros after it. I've been trying to fathom and put into context what this means. I guess one of the ways to think about it is the computation power of 100 million iPhone 7s. 100 million iPhone 7s all going at the same time is what we're going to have in one building, and we're going to have access to. This unprecedented power gives us the ability to understand the connectivity and run models that will let us see alternative futures and help get those benefits. So the project that's tying this all together, you probably saw a poster out there if you walked around, something called the Urban EXASCALE project. This is being led by Charlie Catlett again. You heard his name a lot. So I have to thank Charlie for all the work he's been doing. I told him he should have given this talk, since half the work I've been showing here was related to him somehow. He will be giving a talk again, I think, on the array of things coming up fairly. I think he's going to be giving one of these. He's given a talk in the past on some of his urban work, his urban data work. But the idea here is we have a model that couples people as agents to transportation system as agents, these little cars all running around, to buildings as individual buildings, to our atmosphere. And then in between all this is the communications and the power systems that connect all these systems together as well. And the idea here of developing this Uber model, if you will, it's SimCity, but with real physics and real socioeconomics. What we want is to develop this so that city planners and city officials can come in and say, what will happen if I change this road from a 4-lane road to 3 lanes with a bike lane, 3 lanes with an electric vehicle lane? We want to know if I go and take the old Finkel site and give it to Amazon or give it to Google or turn it into low-income housing, which is the one that's going to have the better effect on our community in 20, 30, 40 years. Those are the questions we hope to answer, that things like Aurora and the things like our models and all our data and our real-time status and intelligent networks and our models for population dynamics are going to tell us. So what I hope and what I think we can do here at Argonne is take our science and engineering and basically take what we're worried about here and turn it into this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ralph. Fascinating talk, and wow, it's really a complex system we're having in our own neighborhood here. No wonder people talk about urban metabolism, right? And scientists studying urban metabolism. I'm really looking forward to the moment where I will be able to help you and look at how green spaces can be put in the cities to improve air quality, to improve quality of life.
We just have to write the proposal together, Christine. This
Be
is
happy
the
to.
thing. We just need to write the proposal.
Right?
Yeah.
How we can do
There we go.
things like...
Deal.
How we can do things like urban farming, and how can that help the flow of things in and out of the city, and how can it improve our life. So with that, thank you very much, Ralph.
Okay.
Again. And we have time now for questions from the audience. And so if we have ushers in the room, they have microphones. So if you could wait to speak until you get one so everybody can hear your question, please.
Yeah, thank you. You know, I was here for a lecture last year, and it was about design of nuclear reactors. And I asked a question as to, you know, why we didn't develop some of these safer types of nuclear reactors. And what it came down to was Hyman Rickover, the admiral that was running the Navy, wanted to have a nuclear power plant that would work in a boat, a submarine. So my question is this: you've got all this computing power, but people have this tendency to follow greed and self-interest as opposed to what you scientists show as the prescribed path, let's say. So have you ever thought to make a model that would try to understand why our political class, our wealthy people, always, you know, go after the quick buck, and then we're left with a problem that, you know, haunts us for 100 or 1,000 years or whatever?
So actually, I hear some snickers. That's not, I think, a foolish question or a foolish model to put together. I can't say that we're putting together a model to understand the absolute greediest people. However, understanding the different motivations of different policymakers is a model, and actually, I don't know where he is. As a student at University of Illinois, Chicago, Eric Berea, who had worked with me over the summer and worked with Chick a little bit over the summer, who is right now putting together a thesis trying to understand the process. It's an agent-based model, this one that does individual people, of how a smaller cities like Gary's of the world make decisions, and how you can, using that sort of model and the knowledge of what motivates people, how you can get together the right people at the right time so that they have a mutual benefit of, oh, I'm doing this for economic reasons. Yes, but your economics can be better if you do this green thing, and everybody can win. So I can't say that we can necessarily understand the motivations or want to model the motivations of people who are evil greedy. We can at least try to, for people who are at a default, I'm just going to worry about the short-term benefits, understand the long-term benefits, and find ways that they can still make out at the same time other people are making out. So we are trying to do that.
Thank you. My name's Joe Listwan. What role do you think 5G will play in these smart cities? 5G.
Oh, 5G. Okay. Well, I could talk about bio. No, I will talk about 5G for a second. Okay, for those of you, the question was, what role will 5G take, in case it wasn't picked up on the system? What role will that play? So 5G is 5th generation of wireless communication systems. For those of you who have your phones, the very first cell phones where you could make a call and do simple text was 2G. 3G was when we were able to actually transmit some video back and forth. 4G is what most of us are on now, where, oh, I not only can have some video, I can actually have video that is really streaming high definition. 5G is the next generation that actually will have the speed of communication is what you can have with a fiber going to your house. We'll be able to be on your phone and doing wireless. So the interesting thing about that is we can have completely wireless communication systems, and the amount of data we can transmit back and forth can be, enormous. I see it changing the way that people decide to make use of communication. I don't know that 5G is necessarily an enabler or an important part of us having new technology throughout much of the way to make our system as a city better. The amount of data that you need and would come out of sensors that we're talking about, like the array of things, is not as big as you would think. So I don't know that it is an enabling technology for most of us trying to build the systems better. It becomes a game changer in how people will decide to communicate, as if they haven't changed enough over the last 50 years. And I can't tell you that I think that it is going to be a game changer. I know it's going to make things more convenient for everybody, but I don't personally think that it's going to be a huge game changer. I do think it's going to be a huge part of the economy because people will want that convenience. I guess the one place where I can see it making a difference has to do with vehicles. The one problem we have, the amount of data that you have back and forth for vehicles when they're trying to talk to each other through connected vehicles for safety reasons is enormous. The big problem is while 5G gives you a lot of bandwidth, it doesn't speed up the speed of light. So if I have a car and I'm driving down the road and now I can send all kinds of information up to the cloud and they can process it and send it back. And if it takes 1/10 of a second, I ran over the deer, you know? So until I can change the speed of light, I don't see the leap forward because there's still always going to be delays. What it means is I can have more information coming to my car. So when I run over the deer, I can be watching 3 videos at the same time, but I'm still going to run over the deer.
Questions again? Down there at the bottom? There you go.
Where's the question? Back here.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. I was wondering about how you kind of disseminate this information. It seems like open source would be the best way to share and look at and see if you can take these technologies and apply them on a small scale, maybe to your own suburb or subdivision or city or village. And I was just wondering about how you plan on actually sharing this information, because there seems like a lot of cool technologies.
So when it comes to the models that we've been talking about, the things like ChiSim and the building models that we work with, and even this large Uber model, the EXASCALE, the core parts of this, the modeling infrastructure, are things that are being released as open source. The one problem that we have in terms of a model for the entire city of Chicago is much of the data that would go into the infrastructure are pieces of information that are private or personally identifiable. So while it may be something that you can run a simulation to see how all the systems interact, you can't necessarily make all the data that goes into it available to everyone. So you can have the infrastructure that's available, but the data, those data itself may not necessarily be something that can be allowed out. Because I may have information statistically about all the vehicles driving around. But if I really need to know about a particular building and its energy use for me to fill out this model, that may not be something that the owner wants to let out into the world. So it may be that we have it here at Argonne because we're trusted to be able to keep this stuff private. Argonne gets hacked at 50 million times a day, and we haven't given up our nuclear secrets yet. We don't have many nuclear secrets here, but we know how to try to keep things safe, which means we also know how to do protection. And it's not something I can't just put out on GitHub, the model of the city of Chicago that has the details of everybody's building and who has a car there and how many wires are connected to it and how many pipes are connected to it. So the problem, and one of the difficulties is going to be how do we let this use? So it may be that basically you have, while the model and the infrastructure goes out. So if you're from Indianapolis, I give you the basics of the model. You have to fill out the data, and you have your own little data server that runs it. And then the city of Indianapolis may keep their own server that people use as a service. Here I go ahead and ask a question, and it puts back an answer. That's how I see it will happen. But the actual tools and models themselves, almost everything we use is being released as open source. I say almost because I can't vouch for all the other projects that are going on. But the Polaris traffic model is open source. ChiSim is being open source. The EXASCALE model, each of those models that are going into that are all open source. It's just the underlying data that actually feeds much of it, not all of that is open source.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I'm really interested in the cities with rich history, like you just mentioned, Kaifeng in China. And when there is a conflict with the historic sites that we need to preserve versus the innovation construction of a smart city that we need to develop, what would be the suggestion on how to balance this conflict? Thank you.
That's good. The first suggestion is we actually make sure our little models that we have, I say little because computationally they're not as difficult as the electric grid. The little models that we have for a social interaction and those models of the people, we try to understand what is the value. And I don't know the answer to this, but how do you put a value on the historical significance? That is something that I think, at least in theory, is something that is doable. And it would be something you could put into a system to try to weigh the benefits. Now, the problem comes in is what's the societal benefit? And where do you draw that line? And I guess that's why we elect officials who have really tough decisions to make, and then we're always mad at them, because they're the people who have to make that decision. But it is something that could be put into a model that when you're trying to do an optimization, that you have an economic benefit, you have a societal or a sustainability benefit, that you have a convenience benefit, but we can also have a cultural significant benefit. When you're then running this, you have a certain weight that you put and say, there's a certain value to this. Now, people like to put everything in terms of economics, and when I do my models, I don't like to turn everything into a number that's a dollar amount, because I think that's a false sense of a trade-off. I think I'd rather just have it, you have a quantity here that is your historical value, and you weigh that the same as some dollars. And you might say there must be a dollar equivalent then, but I don't like to think of it that way. And I think that's an answer that may be able to try to take that into account. The hard question then is, okay, you put in your model, who gets to decide what the numbers are? And unfortunately, while we have a democratic society that elects officials, I don't think we want to do that decision of how you weight these things by referendum. It would be a really difficult thing to do. I think that's about it. That's all we have time for. Oh, we do? No, I think we've run over.
I had one more question.
Okay, one more question.
Yeah, maybe I'm echoing what was just asked, but as I look at the two pictures, I'm just not quite sure that the one on the right really represents much of an improvement in terms of the scale and the human scale of, I know one is looks like it's a very poor neighborhood, but the other seems dominated by cars. And I just wonder, again, maybe it's a question of how your models deal with things like the human scale of these neighborhoods.
I think that's a good point. And when I chose what I want my city to be, I wanted to have a real picture and not something that was made by an architect's rendition or an artist's rendition, which led me to finding something that might actually be familiar. This is Chicago now. This is a Chicago with the new throughput that they're doing. And I think that Chicago, the way it's changing, is not so much different from what we might want in 50 years, at least parts of Chicago. Sorry, I can't give your answer of if that's exactly what I want. I love Chicago. I love Chicago a lot, so I don't want to see it change all that much. Okay, thank you.